At first glance, the changes didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single moment when everything shifted. Instead, it happened slowly. Plans, surveys, quiet conversations about land, and then decisions. In the last episode, we explored what life looked like along the Catawba River before the lake. Farms, mill villages, and communities built over generations. Places where people lived and worked inside systems that often presented themselves as stable, even benevolent. Mill owners built houses, company stores extended credit, work shaped the rhythm of daily life. Farmers worked the land, communities gathered around churches and schools. Daily life moved within the seasons. For many families, those systems offered survival, routine, and a sense of community. Over time, those ways of life began to feel permanent. But permanence was beginning to shift. As industry expanded across the region, the mills, farms, and communities along the river became part of something much larger, a growing demand for power, development, and control over the river itself. In this episode, we begin to see what happened when the vision moved forward and what it meant for the people living along the Catawba River. Historian Chuck McShane joins us again to help us understand how the shift began.
One of the things that's interesting, though, is that this area was probably one of the more rural areas, and it was planned. The Lake Norman project was planned very early on. So Duke Energy, or Southern Power at the time, really even before it merged with Duke Power, they began this process of developing and damming the Catawba River to create these lakes as early as their early 1900s. Lake Wiley was the first in 1904.
As historian Chuck McShane explains, the Catawba River was becoming part of something larger, a system designed to generate power across the region. And that shift didn't stay confined to plans or boardrooms. It unfolded in communities, on farms, and in the everyday lives of people living along the river. Michael Connor remembers what that looked like. Thinking about that, how far in advance did Duke Power reach out to your grandfather?
Um, well, I think it was in 1962. But don't forget, Duke Power had started this process 60 years before they got to this point. And that's why I believe that Charles Gibson probably knew that this was going to happen. Because in 1916, there was a flood, and that flood killed about 80 people.
Long before the dam was built, the Catawba River had already shown what it could do. Flooding wasn't new to the people living along the river. But in the summer of 1916, everything changed. Two powerful storms crossed the Carolinas within days of each other. Rain fell for days without stopping, so much that the ground could no longer hold it. The rivers rose fast. The Catawba climbed more than 40 feet above flood level. Bridges collapsed, railroad tracks disappeared underwater, mill villages and farming communities were cut off from the outside world. Next to the Long Island Mill, the roof of the Monbo Cotton Warehouse was torn away by floodwaters. Livestock floated downstream beside broken telegraph poles and debris carried by the river. Hydroelectric stations along the Catawba were heavily damaged. For some listeners, The deconstruction described in 1916 may sound painfully familiar. More than a century later, Hurricane Helene would leave communities across the region facing many of the same fears: rising water, isolation, and sudden loss. For many people in 1916, it was the worst flooding they would ever witness. But for James B. Duke and Southern Power, the flood revealed something else. The river that powered their growing system could destroy it. In the years after the flood, Southern Power and Duke's growing network of engineers began expanding their control along the river. James B. Duke, alongside engineers like William States Lee and C.E. Brockholder, imagined a new system of dams and reservoirs across the Catawba. By 1920, Duke interests had purchased Long Island Mill, Monbo, and East Monbo, tying the future of those communities to the company's expanding plans for the river. And for families living there, those changes were no longer distant ideas.
So they own these things, and they just figure out what can we do, because if this flood happens again, we're going to knock out a lot of other stuff we can't grow. So they started putting dams up. But not only did they start doing it, the Wiley brothers started doing it down near Fort Mill. And so they got together and they called it something called Southern Power. And so they knew that they were going to do this because they'd gone and seen in New York where, New York had this damn thing going. They said, oh, we can do that too. We can start this electricity thing going. And that's what they started doing. Now, I think Charles Gibson may have known about this because it wasn't going to come right away, but it was going to happen. So 1922, which is right after 6 years after 1916 when the flood happened, it was like the plan is going to happen. But when is what Gibson didn't know.
What Mr. Connor remembers was unfolding across communities all along the river. The river itself was being reimagined. The push for hydroelectric power didn't happen overnight. By the early 20th century, industrial growth across the Carolinas was transforming both the landscape and the river itself.
Because if you think about when the building projects happened, when more of these rivers were dammed, more of the lakes were built along the Catawba River, there was a big surge in the 19-teens and into the 1920s. Then the demand for power, the expansion of these power plants, really took a pause during the Great Depression because there wasn't as much industrial expansion until that started to ramp up again post World War II.
But these plans weren't unfolding in empty spaces. Farms, mill villages, churches, and family land already lined the riverbanks.
If the Great Depression hadn't happened, Lake Norman probably would have been created much earlier. So Duke Power, Southern Power, had been in the process of buying up bits and pieces of the land since the 1920s. And so there weren't as many communities there as there might have been had it been a more compressed timeline.
By the time of the 1916 flood, James Duke and Southern Power were already becoming deeply connected to the Catawba River. But the story did not begin with the flood. To understand how Duke became one of the most influential figures in the region's growing power industry, we need to step back for a moment to the origins of Southern Power and the people who helped shape what would eventually become Duke Power and then Duke Energy.
James B. Duke lost an antitrust suit because he captured 90% of the tobacco market in the early 1900s with American tobacco. He lost an antitrust suit, so he needed to figure out something else to do with his money. He was from North Carolina, and he knew that the textile mills were starting to ramp up here, and he knew that there was a transition happening from water power to electrical power. So he made some early investments in electricity in the area, initially to power industry. So initially to power textile mills. Well, it started with James Duke and Gil Wiley, William States Lee, early on. Early on in the process, those were really the driving forces of it. So Wiley and Duke were the initial founders of Southern Power, which would grow into the Duke Energy Corporation eventually. And so it was really a long-term vision of where the water would go when the river was dammed, and Lake Norman would be the final project and would be the largest project. Really, what it was needed for in the 1950s was this explosion of demand for power, both because of population growth, but also because of all the appliances and modern conveniences that started to be used and needed for that peak load power. And that from washing machines, your dishwashers, your air conditioning, especially during this time in the 1950s. And that's really what drove the final production of it. But there was a string of executives and engineers in the Duke Energy Corporation who were the driving forces behind it. But it all started as part of this broader plan to electrify the South along the Catawba River.
The plans for the lake were shaped in offices by engineers, executives, and decision makers. But the experience of that change looked very different on the ground. For some families, the changes unfolded slowly, in real time.
Hello, my name is Katie Davis Dickinson. I'm retired from the state of North Carolina, and I live in Huntersville, North Carolina.
Katie Dickinson grew up in Huntersville, watching the water rise around her community. Her memories sit right at that turning point between what was and what was becoming. And so, Katie, you said that your dad actually worked for Duke Power. How long did he work for Duke?
His whole life. He started when he was 18 years old, and they were just starting to put all the extension wires and substations, and he went to work for Duke Power, as did several students that had just graduated from Huntersville High School back then. And he worked on them till he was 56 years old, and they told him if he didn't retire then, he'd have to go all the way to 65. So he said, I'll go ahead and retire. And he was actually made more money from Duke Power being retired and having freedom to be with the family that he was excited. He said, but I didn't know what I was going to do with my life, because everything had been around substations and building and working around the dams, and that was his life.
Did he have a role in creating the dam at Lake Norman?
Well, he had an interest in it because he worked for Duke Power and where they were going to end up. He knew the plan for the properties and stuff, and people were selling their properties or moving them or having them destroyed, selling them to Duke Power when they needed a specific area. So he was involved with that, and he didn't do any like damming or flooding.
At first, the changes showed up in small ways. Roads shifting, movement changing, daily routines adjusting. But those early changes were only the beginning. So how did the creation and flooding of Lake Norman kind of change Mecklenburg and Catawba counties, both physically and culturally?
Physically, it's interesting. If you talk to people who were around before the Lake Norman was dammed, they will say, I'm going across the river. So the river was always something of a geographical barrier, but by the 1950s, it wasn't so much because you had bridge building, you had cars, so there wasn't as much separation between the two sides of the river.
We had a 55 Chevrolet, and they had that little side window, and open. And so it was so hot in the summertime up here, we had to take the window down. And we were driving home. And never forget, took our heads out toward the window, hat went off. Mom, stop the car! Go back and get the hats, Stop the car. We have to turn around, go get the gas. It wasn't a lot of traffic coming this way back then, but there were like bridges along the way, and so my sisters, we always gave them, that's Sylvia's bridge, that's Josephine's bridge. Oh, we almost there. We getting ready to come to Pam's bridge. Okay, and so we knew it was going to take about a half hour to get there anyway. But we always had fun, going there as well as we did coming back.
Now with the lake damming, I think you saw more of a separation between southeastern segment of Lake Norman, which really started to grow and become much more oriented toward Charlotte, and then the western side of the lake and northern sides of the lake, which remained relatively rural for a longer time. You saw some growth there, but the growth really started to concentrate in that northeastern segment of Charlotte and the southeastern segment of the lake.
The expansion of power across the Carolinas reshaped more than industry. It also reshaped everyday life along the river itself. Roads were rerouted, connections between communities shifted, and familiar places slowly began to disappear beneath the rising water.
There were some roads that were eliminated, but some of the roads were still running up to Old Statesville Road or over at Collins Ford in that area, that you could drive down the roads to where the water, till you got to the point where the water was, you shouldn't go any farther than you should stay back off of the water. But it would just be like a regular road you're riding along, and then all of a sudden you're looking and there's water, and you can see all the way across the lake where it's rising. So that went on for several years.
So talk to me about, you said when you were a kid, you would go and see the water in the neighborhoods. Talk about that experience.
Well, it was kind of scary because all our roads had an end to them. But these roads didn't have it. I mean, they had a big water. It was a gradual fall. I mean, you weren't just diving into a pool of water. You had, a few inches of water and then a few feet of water. And you're like, that's enough. We were close enough. But I can remember us when I was a family of 4 kids, and we'd take our old meet-up clothes and shoes, and our mom would let us play in the mud where they were building, and my dad would know who was going to be, in what area was going to be, getting flooded more. So we could sit out there and sit in cold mud, and we didn't care.
How old were you when the lake was being?
Well, there were 4 of us in 4 years, and I was the oldest. And I don't think I was like teenage years, or I'd have been a little prissier than that, maybe, as far as sitting in the mud. But it was in the 60s anyway. Mm-hmm. I know that.
So you were a young kid looking at this water, rise up.
Every week. And if we went to the same place more than one time in a weekend, a road that we had just driven down the weekend before, we couldn't get, it was still, you had to go way back to get to that point. And you could kind of tell, well, we'd been over at that point. And my parents made a little lesson of it about how the water was coming through and everything.
Was it like a week? Each week it would rise, or every day?
No, we only went up there like maybe once a week, but we did go pretty regularly once a week. And sometimes we'd go over to Shuffletown when it was getting a little deeper over here.
Shuffletown.
It's the west side of Charlotte, between let's see, Long Creek and out toward that direction, toward West Charlotte, where they had the speedway out there, and it was not too far from the Charlotte Motor Speedway, the Shuffletown Speedway, and you could park anywhere you wanted to. I mean, there were like driveways and stuff where they had already started in that area going back to where they were coming from the north. It was moving toward the south.
Did you see a lot of other people also kind of like looking at the lake rise, or was it just you and your family kind of?
Well, I think we were the only crazy people. The rest of them just kind of stayed away. But occasionally you'd see somebody out there, walking around in the mud, or, seeing if there was any good wood left or anything. But it wasn't like everybody in Huntersville was, hey, let's go out to the lake and get some fresh wood, or rocks or something. We didn't have to do that.
As the region continued to grow, the changes along the river became impossible to ignore. Roads disappeared, communities became harder to reach, and familiar places along the river were beginning to disappear beneath the rising water.
But every week for several years, they were letting water go over the dam to um, level out the lake because they had dammed up the lake, and they were trying to level it off as it went down the stream down toward Charlotte. So, but I can remember going over there, especially on Sundays when we were riding around with my dad looking at stuff about where he would show that this property last week had been moved, 50 feet, and the water coming up. They had to do it gradually. And they tried to eliminate some of the properties there, the houses, the barns, and the properties that they had to acquire to run the lake all the way through Charlotte. So we'd go up and see. It'd be like a big mud hole, but he seemed to not mind that we got in the mud. But you could see where even years later, people that were swimming in Lake Norma would come upon on a low tide day, sort of, when it hadn't rained a while. You could actually see homes, and some people just walked away from their homes and left everything in it, and never went back because Duke was paying them. They wanted to get that water over everything in this area.
For some, the lake represented progress. For others, it meant leaving behind something that could not be replaced. So, what was the community's reaction? You said some people left their homes and left things that were there. Was it seen as a progressive move to have this lake that was going to be used for hydroelectricity in the community?
Yeah, I think the majority of people did like that, and Duke Power was not one to be cheap. If they came and wanted your property, it didn't like some Gestapo thing showing up. It's, we're going to give you X amount and X amount and X amount. And it was generous from what real people, that were involved in it would say. They couldn't turn down that kind of money.
But was it generous for everyone or just certain people?
Well, everybody I saw, I knew several people that had farms, and they didn't really want to give up their farms. But when Duke paid them like they did, they just went and bought some more property that wasn't in the way. And it like I said, it was very generous. Nobody ever complained about, they threw me out. They bought my property for a more than fair price. And they did that all over until they got the lake the way they wanted it.
As the project moved forward, communities along the river responded in different ways. For some, the changes brought opportunity. For others, they brought disruption and uncertainty. And so we talked about Duke's perspective, but what about the perspective and the responses of the local communities at the time? Was it welcome, contested, mourned?
A little bit of both. I would say, from what I found in the reports from the time that I found, it was really an area that was forward looking. So if you think about the time period, it's late 1950s. There's a lot of focus on space age, focus on the future, right? And so at the same time, you already had a movement away from the farms and into more city life. So in general, what I found is people were really welcoming it. Certainly that's not everyone. There were certainly some farmers who were very attached to their land, wanted to stay, and there were some very difficult conversations on courthouse steps that finally led to folks letting go of the land. There were some who refused to cede it, and held on to even the bottom of the lake for a time period. We're still paying taxes on it for a while, but in general, from what I could tell, it was really the progress was welcomed, and the opportunity to sell the land was tended to be welcomed, at least in the public proclamations that I've seen in newspapers and others. I think there was certainly some mourning of the loss of the family land.
For many families along the river, the relationship with Duke Power became deeply personal. The changes happening across the region were now unfolding in their own communities and backyards. And do you remember hearing stories about what it was like watching the water rise and cover part of the farm? Because it sounds like it was such a successful farm.
Oh yeah, it was. And the thing was, they, my uncle, he lived down from my grandfather, and I would stay with him in the summertime. After stay with my grandfather, I would get with him, and we'd drive into Charlotte. All of it was a dirt road, and so they were still working on it when we got there. This is like 1960 or so. So they were, and they came up and told my grandfather, they said, this is where the water's going to come, and it's going to stop right here, and it's not going to go any further. But if it goes back in, all that land that it covered becomes your land again. Well, they weren't going to let that happen, okay? So my uncle from Detroit came down, and he said the water came right to where they said it was.
For many families, the changes brought by the lake were about more than land or property. They also affected places tied to memory, ancestry, and generations of family history.
I think one of the more delicate assignments that Carl Blades, who was responsible for clearing the land, working with the family, who worked with Duke Energy at the time, Duke Power at the time, was movement of headstones and church cemeteries. That was a big, a very emotional and challenging as well. If you think about tracking down next of kin for an area that had settlers for 200 years, was one of the more difficult and delicate assignments.
However, they had I forgot how many graves down there that they had to move, and they said that they would move the graves. And I remember Dad coming home saying that they did remove the graves. I don't think they got all of them, but he said when they opened the coffins, everybody just turned to dust, because my cousin, who was about 3 years old when his mother got murdered, she was buried there, Josephine, and he was talking about Josephine's coffin when they opened it up, and she just turned to dust, a lot of long hair and stuff like that. He was saying, but she was really gone. So they redid the graves because Duke Power had given them a place for the new church to be built and gave them a new place for the graveyard. It's about 2.5 acres, if it's that much, that they gave them. And so they reburied them, and they tried to do it in families, in a row and things like that. And so that's still there to this day. Some of the people didn't, they just didn't have markers on the graves. And some that they did move had markers that you couldn't read. So those things were done. But I remember them talking about that. We didn't come up because the church was still being built. And I guess the people must have worshiped in somebody's house or something, because the church hadn't been built until, 61 later on, because the cornerstone is there now. But they had replaced the bell that was in the old church. They tried to bring that back. But they have it there, but it doesn't work. The little bell that my great-grandfather used to ring, they were able to savor that, and so that is still in the church itself.
For families living in the mill villages, the rising water marked the beginning of profound change. Communities built around millwork and company housing were being dismantled. The rhythms of daily life, worship services, baseball games, shift whistles, and evenings spent among neighbors were disappearing alongside the landscape itself. And like many farming communities along the river, mill families also faced the loss of home, stability, and belonging. For both farmers and mill workers, the changes also threatened something more immediate: their income, livelihoods, and the systems their families had depended on for generations. When Lake Norman is announced to finally begin to start damming, what happens to the people now living in this area where their homes are gone, will be gone, as well as their jobs?
Yeah, the company made them offers, and so they bought their land from them because that land was going to be, underwater, therefore useless. And it took about 4 years before the water came up to a level that we know today. But you're right; they all did have to find a different job. So they either had to go to town and get a job, or find a different factory, a different cotton mill, or maybe a furniture factory to work in, because she had some of those down in that region. But it was a very significant change of lifestyle for these people, and a lot of these kids, they could see it coming. They knew that they weren't going to be employed by the cotton mill, but and for some of them that meant, I better get an education, or I better get skills in a different area so that I can find something to do with the rest, with my working life.
Because unlike other areas, like the people who lived in the mill, they weren't getting paid for the land. The company was getting the money, and they were just the company was giving them, I guess, an opportunity in different ways.
Yeah, some people worked both, tried to do both, tried to hang on, and if they had extra money, they'd buy some land around them and they'd farm a little patch of it, maybe put in a crop, small crop of something, and they got paid for that. But you're right, since they're renting the houses, the company is the one who got paid for the land. And though you have various people argue that they were going to take that money and go over here and build something else to work people, that never happened.
As these communities changed, so did the landscape surrounding them. Duke crews moved through the area, clearing land, removing structures, and preparing the river valley for what would eventually become Lake Norman. What's underneath Lake Norman?
Well, they'd clean it off. They didn't put concrete or mud or rocks or anything. They just got whatever was on top of it, a house, a store, little offices and stuff. There wasn't a lot of buildup out there really, but there were several homes, like people would stay in on the weekends and stuff, and they lost their homes when they got to that point in the lake that they would buy them out. And like I said, everybody that I talked to said, I'm glad they bought Grandma's old house, we don't need all that. And they were very generous about it. And I knew several people that, lost their home but got a really nice home out of what they let Duke Power pay for.
Where did they move?
Most of them were just coming into Huntersville and Davidson, Cornelius more. But yeah, it was a lot of people, and it was some businesses too. But they all seemed to recover, and it was really nice because being on the lake was very appealing to people.
I was gonna say, okay, so they sold their land so they wouldn't be under the lake. So did any of those people buy any land on the lake, since they didn't want their land underneath the lake? Did they buy any land above it?
Well, Duke Power gave every employee they had a certain area of land on the lake when they got through in that area. And my parents had a piece of property out off Shuffletown Road, which is near the Speedway. And we go out there, and we had a wooded lot, and we cook out there, and tried to spend the night there one time, but we were all too scared, so we came on back home. But we had it, and we'd go out there and just stand in the water. It wouldn't be too fast. It wasn't running much, and it was just more like kids playing in mud. But we'd take after church, we'd take a picnic out there and just sit on our little lot.
Some families moved, some rebuilt. Some carried those memories with them long after the land itself was gone. The lake was created to provide hydroelectric power for the region, eventually becoming a centerpiece for recreation and growth and development across the Carolinas. But the transformation of the river did not affect everyone in the same way. For some families, the changes brought opportunity or compensation. For others, they brought displacement, broken promises, and the loss of homes, land, jobs, and community ties that could not easily be replaced. The river had always shaped the lives of the people who lived beside it. Now, those same people were being asked to reshape their lives around the river, and in many cases, to leave it behind entirely. The lake that would become Lake Norman was no longer just an idea. It was real, and the water was still rising. In the next episode, we'll explore what was left behind and how communities remembered what once stood beneath the surface. Made in Carolina is created, produced, and hosted by Lolita Rowe. Special thanks to Chuck McShane, Michael Connor, Katie Dickinson, and Richard Eller for sharing their memories, research, and perspectives for this episode. Original music is by Sister Sai. Additional audio elements were sourced from Freesound, with full credits listed in the show notes. To learn more about this episode, including sources and archival materials, visit madeincarolinapodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, considering following the podcast, leaving a review, or sharing it with someone who might connect with the story. And if you'd like to support the podcast more directly, you can find Made in Carolina on Patreon, where I share bonus content and behind-the-scenes reflections, or Buy Me a Coffee, where we're listed as well. Thank you for listening and for helping keep these stories alive.